Hello everyone. I'm Nora Callahan today. We're talking about the Thursday that split my life clean in half. It's late morning and my coffee's gone cold on the windowsill. Outside, a cargo drone hums past the skyline like it's got more important places to be. I glance at my phone. Metacon stock has dropped another 4.7%. That makes 17% this week. I take another sip. Bitter, appropriate. That's the thing about collapse. It's quiet at first. Nobody hears the steel groan until the beams are already bending. I should know, I was the one who forged them. 6 months ago, I was the chief systems architect at Metacon Systems, the darling of the medical AI world. You've probably seen their name, maybe on the sleek diagnostic terminals at private clinics, or in those breathless investor updates touting next-gen AI-driven care. Yeah, I wrote the architecture that made that happen. Every bit of it. The cross-border licensing. The real-time jurisdictional compliance filters. Even the voice-coded emergency shutdowns. But now I watch them drown in their own oversight. Because they fired me, and replaced me with a fresh-faced Stanford MBA, named Janelle Frost, who thinks adaptive jurisdictional deployment is just a fancy way of saying auto-update. It happened on a Thursday. I remember because it was the day the janitor brought his daughter in after school. She was maybe 10. Curly hair. Doodled on my whiteboard while I ran through system diagnostics one last time. Even that felt more real than what happened next. The building was quiet. Too quiet. I'd gotten the meeting invite just an hour earlier. Urgent strategy session. Conf room, C 5:30 p.m., no subject line, no prep docs, just a vague strategy. In Silicon Valley, that's code for, bring your badge and, maybe a box. I should have known. But you don't build an empire by walking away from red flags. You read them, document them, and then you write one last line of code they'll never see coming. So I walked in past the frosted glass doors, past the wall of patents where my name appeared 27 times, walked into the room I'd once helped name and design and found 3 people I'd grown to distrust waiting with practiced stillness. Bradley Stokes sat at the head of the table. The same guy who once called me the spinal cord of our infrastructure. Now, he couldn't look me in the eye. Beside him sat Janelle, who was too new to know what she was dismantling. The third was a man I didn't recognize. Sharp suit, bad posture, holding a folder with my name on it like it burned. Nora, Bradley said, not quite meeting my eyes. Please take a seat. I'll stand. He sighed. This won't take long. It did. In my head, anyway. Because I heard every syllable in slow motion, every hollow phrase. Reorganization efforts. Series E alignment. Leadership restructure. A script read by a man who'd once danced on a table after our first European contract cleared. Now he looked like someone trying to execute a stray dog behind the building. You're firing me, I said, voice flat, not a question. We're eliminating your position, he corrected, as if the change in phrasing would dull the blade. I nodded. After 7 years. After I built your licensing framework from scratch. Janelle blinked. Your work has been foundational, she offered. I've learned so much. She didn't mean it cruelly. That's what stung most. Bradley slid the folder over. We've prepared a generous severance package. 6 months, salary, extended health. A smooth transition. I designed your cross-national AI licensing system, I said, folding my arms. You can't legally operate outside the US without my authentication. Bradley's smile thinned like cracking glass. We've updated the protocol. Unified Executive Authority now handles all international sign-offs. I remembered the PDF. 6 months earlier. Titled IP Protocol Restructuring, Signature Required. I'd read every line. Spotted the trap. And modified it before returning. The domestic overrides. I allowed those, but the international clause. That stayed intact. Hidden in legal subtext, wrapped in a few benign redundancies. My name's required. They didn't notice. Or they didn't understand. Now here they were, handing me a cardboard box like I was the receptionist, not the architect of the most complex AI governance system ever deployed. I looked at it, then back at them. You'll need my signature for the termination package to be official, right? Yes, the HR man said. I signed, slowly, deliberately, then handed it back. Good luck with the system. Janelle, I said, turning for the door. You'll need it. The elevator ride down was the longest 30 seconds of my life. Not because I was upset, but because I was calculating. They thought it was over. That they'd taken everything. But what they didn't realize is, I never left them with all the keys. Because years ago, during beta testing, I'd created something, not out of paranoia, just caution. A backup server. Clean, unbranded, and logged under a developer shell account registered to an LLC I never told anyone about. I used it for architecture stress tests, data drift analysis, redundancy audits, and then I forgot about it. Until I didn't. That night, I went home, poured a glass of wine, opened my laptop, entered credentials no one knew still existed. There it was, still running, still syncing, still perfect. All it needed was a whisper, and I whispered a single line of code. Not malicious, not destructive, just conditional. If user underscore primary equals null, then revoke underscore global equals true. If they ever tried to erase me from the system entirely, the global licensing framework would begin to quietly revoke itself. Not immediately, not obviously. Just one node at a time, one error message, one failed authentication, cascading into silence. The system wouldn't break, it would forget them. And only then would they remember me, because you can fire the engineer, but you can't delete the architecture without collapsing the structure. So I went to sleep.com, cold-free. And in the morning, I brewed another cup of coffee, hot this time, strong, and watched the first cracks begin to form. The next morning, I woke before dawn, no alarm, no schedule, just instinct, like the old days when we were building something that felt like the future. Only this time, I wasn't trying to build Metacon, I was watching it come undone. I slid open my laptop and tapped the unmarked bookmark. The command line interface blinked at me. Black screen, white text, no logos, no fingerprints, just the quiet hum of a machine waiting for its architect to speak. The shadow server was fully synced. Every authentication certificate, every country-specific protocol, every AI module, dependency cross-referenced and indexed, perfectly in order. It was all still there. Mine. That server had been a footnote in development, originally meant to help us simulate licensing conflicts across jurisdictions. It became my quiet obsession. While others rushed to push updates and chase funding rounds, I fed the shadow instance like a secret garden. I mirrored every update, cleaned every log, scrubbed the metadata of any trace to Metacon systems. I even paid the hosting bills through a prepaid debit card. Old school, completely off-grid, and now, that oversight was my salvation. As global operations lumbered into their first day without me, they had no idea the very fabric of their compliance systems was rigged with a dead man's switch. A trigger, not malicious, not illegal, just justified. I checked the logs. The real-time sync with Metacon's primary servers had occurred at 2:11 a.m. Their system was still feeding mine, still dependent, still exposed. I typed a simple status query. The dual authentication flag was still marked active. My name still listed as primary_key_authority. They hadn't changed the schema, hadn't pushed a new framework, probably didn't even know what to look for. I smiled, because I did. A few hours later, I got my first ping from my former assistant. She'd always been sharper than her job title, underpaid, overqualified, and fiercely loyal. I'd tried to warn her before leaving, told her to watch for signs. She didn't reply at the time, but now she did. Maya, European Ops, having issues. Brussels team says licensing portal won't validate updates. I stared at the message, then sipped my coffee. So soon, I'd expected a few days of silence, but the cracks were surfacing faster than I thought. It made sense. Europe was our most complex licensing zone. 13 countries, each with their own data governance models. Metacon had always relied on the adaptive compliance stack I built. That stack needed dual auth, and without me, let's just say, the errors wouldn't make sense to anyone who didn't write the original syntax by hand. By noon, the bug reports were flooding internal Jira boards. Maya forwarded screenshots, red flags in France, partial timeouts in Italy, full license denial in Germany. The engineers thought it was a patch failure, or a server misalignment. No one suspected the issue was architectural, because no one believed the system could do this, except me. That afternoon, Bradley sent out a company-wide email, titled Licensing Stability, All Hands on Deck. I didn't get to read it obviously, but Maya did. She pasted it into our private Signal thread, chuckling at his desperate phrasing. By the next morning, the IT crisis team was formed. Engineers were flown to Brussels. Legal was pulled in to examine regional contracts. External consultants were contacted. None of them could explain why hospitals were suddenly unable to renew their licenses. The AI tools still worked, but their scope was shrinking. Updates wouldn't load. Regional deployment expansions failed silently to the outside world. Medicon's silence was strategic to insiders. It was panic in polished shoes. On the second night, I opened the shadow server again and added one more lock voice. This time, a soft-spoken phrase, encrypted and hashed to the server's core identity key. Something only I knew, something they couldn't guess, because I'd whispered it to the system myself. Back when it was just code and coffee, that phrase, only the architect can authorize the future. It wasn't just poetic, it was operational. Without it, every attempt to reassign international licenses would fail quietly, deliberately, inexplicably. That night, I rewatched an old onboarding video I'd recorded for new hires. I looked younger then, greener, hopeful. We're not just writing code, I'd said. We're writing trust. When healthcare systems depend on your logic to save lives, your architecture must reflect your values. I paused the video, smiled, bitterly. They should have kept watching that tape. Day 4 brought the first ripple into public view. A quiet post on a medtech forum. Anyone having trouble with Medicon license renewals. Barcelona clinic stuck in limbo for 48 hours. By day 5, it had been reposted 92 times. Germany, Italy, Poland, Singapore, South Korea. I didn't reply. Didn't need to. The architecture was speaking for me. Medicon's share price dipped slightly. Analysts blamed it on temporary compliance, turbulence, but I knew the pattern. The algorithm wasn't crashing. It was protecting itself. All I'd done was turn the lock. Now they were stuck in the house with no key. I had spent the rest of the week writing a different kind of code, a business plan. It felt strange, building something again. Not just lines and logic, but a vision, an antidote. Because here's what most people don't understand about revenge. It doesn't always involve fire and fury. Sometimes it's just withholding access, until the people who discarded you realize you were never just an employee. You were the infrastructure, and when they walk away without saying thank you, forgetting your name, forgetting what you built, you leave them one last gift, an elegant silence, the kind that can't be debugged. The conference room had that sterile chill I'd always hated. That scent of recirculated air and disinfectant, like a hospital pretending to be a startup. It was 5:31 p.m. on the dot when I stepped in, and they were already seated. Bradley, Janelle, and a man I didn't recognize. The chairs were rearranged. Mine, my usual seat, had been moved to the side of the table. A quiet detail but telling. Bradley always loved optics. Nora, he said with the affected calm of someone who thinks they're about to change your life with a difficult conversation. He gestured toward the chair like this was a performance review, not an execution. I remained standing. Janelle glanced at me, nervous. She was doing that thing new hires do, looking for a human connection in a room that had already decided your fate. I didn't hate her. I just pitied her, because she didn't even realize she was the knife they were using to cut me out. This won't take long, Bradley began. It never does, I thought. He talked, of course he did. About streamlining our leadership structure, about aligning with Series E projections, about new approaches to intellectual property management, corporate phrases that meant absolutely nothing and everything at once. I stared at him. You're firing me, I said, flat. Bradley flinched, just barely. Like I'd thrown cold water in his face. We're transitioning your role. To whom? He didn't answer, but the glance he gave Janelle was enough. She looked like she wanted to crawl into the laminate wood grain of the table. Janelle will be taking over leadership of the licensing architecture initiative, he said finally. I'm still listed as the primary signature for all international authorization, I said. You can't even submit updates to the European compliance system without my encryption key. Bradley's expression flattened. We've initiated a protocol revision. Oh, the PDF, I said, voice light, almost amused. The one you rushed me to sign 6 months ago. The man in the suit cleared his throat. Roger Clean, HR, we've prepared a severance package that acknowledges your time here. 6 months salary, extended benefits, and my badge. My laptop. Already packed, I assume. He hesitated. That was answer enough. I looked down at the folder. The weight of 7 years reduced to 15 pages and a cardboard box. It wasn't even insulting, it was boring, it was lazy. I built your system, I said softly. The entire adaptive licensing core. The compliance automation. The ethical fallback gates. You think you're firing a department head, but what you're doing is decapitating the thing that makes your global operations possible. Roger shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I understand this is difficult, Bradley offered. No, I cut in. You understand how to read from a script. What you don't understand is what happens when the one person holding the safety key walks out. Bradley inhaled. We've replaced the legacy dual authentication structure. You signed off on that. I modified it, I said. You didn't notice. That finally got his attention. Janelle blinked. Modified. Read the copy I signed. Carefully, the domestic protocol was changed as you requested. The international clause remained intact. In fact, I reinforced it in 2 places. I'm the only person who can approve licensing renewals in over 40 countries. And if I'm removed from the system, don't. Bradley snapped, voice suddenly hard. Don't make this into something ugly. I'm not making anything, I said. I already made it. You just never looked closely enough to understand what I'd built. I picked up the pen and signed the termination paperwork, one slow looping letter at a time. Good luck, I said as I pushed it back across the table. You're going to need it. Then I left. Not dramatically, not storming out. I walked, slowly. Down the hallway, I helped design. Past the logo I sketched on a napkin during our first month in that warehouse office. Past the patent wall, where my name still gleamed under glass. The exit scanner didn't beep. Someone had already deactivated my badge. Outside, the sky was turning gold, the kind of light that makes you feel nostalgic for moments that haven't even ended yet. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I went home, opened a bottle of wine, and pulled out my old development laptop, the one they didn't know still had access, credentials to the backup server I'd built 3 years ago. They'd forgotten the most basic rule of engineering. Redundancy isn't just protection, it's insurance against betrayal. The login screen was exactly how I remembered it. Plain unbranded black background, white text. Enter credentials, I typed. Slowly, deliberately, the system opened like a whisper. There it was. The full licensing schema, Medicon's international architecture, every country-specific compliance tree. Every legal override clause. Every AI diagnostic node tagged and indexed. The sync logs showed communication with Medicon's mainframe. 2 hours ago, they had no idea they were still feeding a ghost. I stared at the screen. A blinking cursor. Waiting, and I remembered the moment I wrote the original lines. I'd been up for 36 hours. Bradley was asleep on the couch in our old Palo Alto office. I was alone with the code. The weight of it, the responsibility, the terrifying knowledge that we were writing systems that would diagnose humans. Humans not. Users. Not clients. People. So I added a clause. Quietly, just a line. If user_primary equals null. Then revoke_global equals true. A safeguard, not a weapon. A line of code that meant, if ever the original architect was removed from the chain, the system would pause. It wouldn't crash, wouldn't implode. Just pause, until someone worthy held the keys again. Tonight, I activated it. No fireworks, no alarms, just a click, and a whisper. Now I wait. The night after my termination was eerily still. I remember the way the streetlights blinked outside my window like a code only I could read. I sat cross-legged on my apartment floor with that sad little cardboard box they'd handed me like a consolation prize. Inside, a coffee mug, a photo of my first engineering team, half of whom had already been laid off. A thumb drive filled with old workshop slides and some personal photos I'd never backed up. 7 years distilled into 1 square foot of forgettable memorabilia. But I had something else, the backup server. My quiet rebellion, the mirror of Medicon's entire international licensing infrastructure. Clean and independent, and now, awakened. I stared at the blinking terminal and ran another diagnostic. The architecture still recognized me as primary. Still treated my digital signature as the gatekeeper. And most importantly still held the old dual authentication clause like scripture. They hadn't overwritten it. They couldn't. Not without reworking the foundation. And no one, not even Janelle with her shiny MBA and note-taking obsession, had that map. Medicon had bet everything on the belief that tech moves fast enough to forget its architects. They were wrong, because the true architecture of any system isn't just logic, it's philosophy. It's the unspoken why behind every if-then statement. And I'd designed this one with one principle embedded so deeply it couldn't be patched away. Ethics are not optional. Back in the early days, I'd fought tooth and nail to include dual authentication in our framework. Not because it made the code cleaner, it didn't. Not because it was efficient. It definitely wasn't. But because it ensured that no single executive could push AI diagnostic updates without oversight from someone who actually understood the stakes. Someone like me. Bradley had resisted, of course. Redundancy breeds friction, he'd said once during an all-hands. He meant it as a warning. I took it as a compliment. I remember one night, back when we were still friends to Red Bulls deep, arguing over deployment. Tirzy leaned back and laughed. You know you're designing a system that won't let us move fast enough to scale, right? I'm designing one that won't kill people, I replied. Funny how that kind of thinking goes out of fashion the moment investors get involved. But that's exactly why I'd built the fallback, not just for myself but for the architecture, for the hospitals in rural Vietnam that depended on us to scan for early-stage liver cancer, for the clinics in southern Italy running our cardiac prediction models, for the patients who didn't care about series evaluations or corporate roadmaps. They just wanted accurate diagnoses, clean systems, trustworthy tools. So when the PDF came across my desk 6 months ago labeled Internal Protocol Streamlining Document V4.2, I knew something was up. It was buried in legalese. Looked like a compliance update. Most people would have clicked sign and submit without blinking. But not me. I printed it, annotated it with a red pen like it was a midterm exam. Then I poured myself a glass of wine and spent 4 hours dissecting it. That's when I found it. Subsection 11.3. A subtle clause language soft enough to slip through legal review, eliminating the requirement for dual authorization on international licensing renewals. Shifting all control to executive leadership, under the pretense of efficiency, but efficiency without accountability. That's how mistakes become tragedies. So I made a copy, opened the source file, and edited one line. I preserved the dual auth clause but rerouted it. Instead of just marking me as the cosigner, I made myself the final valid. Buried under layers of conditional statements, the system would now default to my confirmation anytime a jurisdictional conflict arose. I also inserted a clause for emerging markets, vague enough to apply globally, specific enough to be enforceable. Then I returned the signed document. They never asked questions. 2 weeks later, my access to project repositories was downgraded. My engineering team was shuffled. Janelle began appearing in meetings I wasn't invited to. I was being erased. Piece by piece. But not fast enough, because the system still recognized my name. Still held my signature like a heartbeat. They forgot that when you fire an architect, you better make sure the blueprints don't scream when you cut them loose. Now, with the conditional statement activated, the system wasn't shutting down, it was whispering back at first. Just subtle issues, authentication mismatches in hospital portals. Then licensing delays. Stalled updates, new deployments silently failing in the background. And nobody could trace it, because to them, it wasn't sabotage, it was entropy. By day 3, tech support in Brussels flagged what they called cascading credential fragmentation, a fancy way of saying, the system is ghosting us. But they didn't know the ghost was me. Medicon scrambled to isolate the issue. But they were treating it like a technical problem. It WASN, single quotes T. It was legal, and legal problems can't be debugged. I leaned back in my chair, watching the error logs populate in real time. A Portuguese hospital denied renewal. A Singaporean diagnostics module locked in expired state. A compliance audit in Poland generating red flags. Each failure was a breadcrumb. A reminder, they removed the one person who could speak the system's language and now the system refused to speak back. And the best part, it was slow, organic, untraceable. Like Rust, that's what people forget about. Architecture IT doesn't have to collapse suddenly. Sometimes it just forgets how to hold itself together. And I wasn't going to stop it because they didn't steal a job from me, they stole trust. And that's harder to rebuild than any server farm. It started with a hiccup in Berlin. A simple support ticket flagged by a mid-tier admin who couldn't get the latest oncology model to push live in their patient diagnostic flow. Normally, an update failure would be routed through European support queue, marked low priority, and forgotten. But this one escalated. Because when they tried again, the system didn't just refit it, revoked the license entirely, then Madrid, then Rotterdam, Then a teaching hospital in southern Denmark reported that its entire cardiac prediction stack had entered a pending authentication state despite being on an auto-renewal contract. I watched the logs blink across my screen like a Morse code confession. The cascade had begun. By the time Brussels triggered an internal severity alert, the system had already frozen 14 licensing instances across 8 countries. All new updates required a verification chain that looped endlessly, waiting for a signature that would never arrive. Mine. I checked the code. My failsafe was behaving exactly as I designed. The conditional clause had activated. If the system detected that the primary architect's credentials had been removed, the Global License Authority would gradually rescind new authorizations. Not all at once. That would be too obvious. Too easy to spot and fix. No, the revocation spread like a cold front, slowing system performance, delaying logins, quietly eroding trust. Maya texted again. Maya, Bradley's locked in meetings. Rumor is someone's flying out from the board. Maya, he's blaming the engineering team. Maya, someone mentioned your name. He threw his tablet at the wall. I didn't reply, partly because I didn't want to endanger her further, partly because there was nothing to say. They'd made their decision. I'd simply activated the outcome. By day 4, whispers had made it to the forums. Hospital IT managers compared notes. A Reddit thread appeared in a niche medtech subtitled, "Anyone else seeing weird licensing failures on Medicon's EU platform?" I watched it gather momentum. The subreddit was usually dry, mostly vendor gripes and uptime logs, but now it pulsed with screenshots, error messages, theories. Some blamed bad patches. Others suspected malware. No one guessed the truth. That the system wasn't failing because it was broken, it was failing because it had been violated, and the architecture was holding the line. On the morning of day 5, I brewed coffee and refreshed my financial dashboard. Medicon's stock had dropped 3.7%. A Morgan Stanley analyst report tagged them with potential regulatory exposure in Europe. Nothing serious, just a tremor. But I knew what came next. That afternoon, I received an email, not from legal, this time, from Bradley. Subject: "We should talk, Nora. I hope you're well. We've been seeing some anomalies in the international licensing framework. I know you've moved on, but I think your insight would be incredibly valuable right now. There may be an opportunity to consult compensated. Of course, please call me." Bradley. I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled up the call logs from the backup server. Their mainframe was still pinging mine every 6 hours, like a dog chasing its own tail. Each time, it received partial handshakes, enough to keep it hopeful, never enough to resolve. That night, I activated the second lock. The voice authenticated protocol I'd seeded deep in the system's compliance engine. A string that sounded like poetry to anyone else. Only the architect can authorize the future. I spoke it aloud. The code accepted my voice print. A new layer activated hidden behind conditional logic and obfuscated in redundant metadata. Now, any attempt to rewrite or overwrite international protocols would require not just executive sign-off, but the original voice print paired with biometric validation. In other words, me, or nobody. Medicon could try to rewrite the architecture, sure, but rebuilding my framework from scratch would take years, hundreds of regulatory renegotiations, tens of millions in legal fees. They wouldn't survive it. And judging by the next morning's news ticker, they knew it. MedTech Pulse. Medicon facing disruption in EU licensing as internal sources report. Infrastructure recalibration. I laughed. Infrastructure recalibration is the kind of phrase you invent when you don't want to say, "We've completely lost control." Day 6 brought the first real financial damage. 2 major contracts, one in the Netherlands, one in Austria, filed formal notices of breach due to license unavailability. That triggered automatic clause reviews, which triggered compliance investigations, which triggered, well, panic. Bradley called again, this time from a blocked number. I let it ring out. Then I played the voicemail. "Nora, it's Bradley. Look, I get it, I really do. But this is bigger than us. There are patients involved. You said it yourself, we built this to help people. Don't let it fall apart over a miscommunication. Please, call me." I played it again, then deleted it. It was strange, hearing him say we built this, as if he still thought he had equal claim to what I wrote in solitude, in the dark hours when no one else believed it could be done. Letting it fall apart. No, letting them see what happens when architecture is built with values and those values are ignored. That night, I finalized my business charter. I'd been outlining it quietly in the background pages of ideas, names, code snippets. Now, it was official Callahan Licensing Group, a new framework, an alternative built on the bones of what we once dreamed Metacon could be. Not just tech for good branding, but tech with enforced transparency, tech that couldn't be hijacked for quarterly gains, tech that respected borders, data, and most importantly, humans. I sent the incorporation documents just after midnight. Then I opened the backup server one more time and whispered, soon. The call came at 2:04 a.m. My phone buzzed once, hesitated, then buzzed again, a familiar rhythm from a number that used to light up my screen daily. I watched it ring without moving. Just stared, half amused, half curious. By the time I finally picked up, I already knew exactly how the conversation would go. Nora, Bradley's voice cracked. Not from emotion, he was too tightly wound for that, but from exhaustion. Please don't hang up. I didn't say anything, just waited. We need to talk. There it was. Not a request. A veiled command. The same cadence he used in boardrooms, in all-hands meetings, in those smug internal videos where he'd smile like a politician and say words like scalability and global alignment while standing in front of charts I'd built. How did you get this number? I asked, finally. He cleared his throat. IT still had some of your contact metadata in the backup logs. Don't worry, nothing invasive, just ... Look, it doesn't matter. It matters, I replied coldly. Start with that. Then you can tell me why Metacon's entire international licensing architecture is falling apart. A beat of silence. I imagined him standing there in his overpriced condo, hair unkempt, sleeves rolled to his elbows like that somehow made him look like he was working harder. You know what's happening, he said, his voice lower now, less rehearsed. The licensing keys aren't authorizing updates. Country deployments are stalling. New hospitals can't activate diagnostics. We're hemorrhaging trust. Nora. I let the silence do the work for me. It stretched, tightened. He caved. First, please, just tell me what you want. I stood up and walked to the window. San Francisco looked like it always did at night, quiet, expensive, and completely unaware of its own fragility. I want you, I said slowly, to explain to your board why the system stopped working after you erased me. We didn't erase you, he said quickly. We were consolidating power. I cut in, rewriting the architecture to bypass the only person who understood the ethical scaffolding you built your company on. You didn't just fire me, Bradley. You tried to amputate the soul from the body and act surprised when it stopped breathing. I didn't know, he said quietly. Yes, you did, I replied. He didn't argue. A full 15 seconds passed before he tried again. Look, we're prepared to offer reinstatement, CTO title, full control of the framework, equity, retroactive, acknowledgement of your contributions, whatever it takes to bring you back in. It was tempting, in the way a match might tempt a freezing person. But I had something better now. Something that wasn't just Firebutt Foundation. I'm not coming back, I said. You're going to let it all burn. No, I replied. I'm building something else. Something that doesn't rely on gatekeepers who forget why we built it in the first place. You mean the Callahan Licensing Group? The name rolled off his tongue like a slur. Word travels, I said. We can acquire it, fund it, absorb it. Whatever your price is, name it. I smiled. You still think this is about money, I said. But this isn't a negotiation. This is a transition. Your company is a rotting house. Mine is the future blueprint. He sighed loudly, frustrated, tired, desperate. You're going to tank Meta. I'm not, I corrected. You already did. Then I hung up. That morning, the news broke. Healthcare AI giant faces licensing meltdown. A leaked internal memo revealed that Metacon's global operations were in violation of over 24 jurisdictional agreements due to unresolved authentication protocols. A redacted email from Bradley to the board included the damning phrase, "The dual signature protocol has been deprecated in all but name." The market reacted as markets do with blood. The stock dropped 12% before noon. Forums exploded. Threads titled "Did Metacon Lie to Regulators?" and how one clause could undo a $2.6 billion company topped trending tags. And Callahan Licensing Group's website, barely a landing page a week ago, suddenly had traffic. That night, I poured a glass of wine and opened the new email dashboard we'd set up. 3 new messages from major European hospital networks. 2 more from Singaporean regulatory liaisons, and 1 from a South American healthcare NGO, looking for alternatives after experiencing repeated Metacon errors. I forwarded everything to Raj, my lead engineer and the first person I brought into this new world. Raj had been pushed out of Metacon 6 months before me. Downsized during one of those strategic recalibrations meant to impress investors. He was brilliant, quiet, the kind of guy who annotated code with philosophical questions, and ate cold oatmeal because he forgot lunch existed when he was deep in the system. Now he was mine again. Beside him, I'd brought in Dr. Alina Martinez, a former medical ethicist from Metacon's advisory board. She'd raised concerns about the lack of transparency in AI diagnostics. They'd called her unskippable, so she joined me instead. And then of course, Maya. My loyal whip's ruthless operations lead. She kept the world moving when I wanted to disappear into my code. The 4 of us sat in a co-working space that reeked of lavender diffusers and bad startup dreams, but it didn't matter, because what we were building had weight. Our licensing framework was simple, transparent, and ethical by design. No black boxes, no executive overrides. Just logic, agreements, and accountability. We weren't trying to destroy Metacon, we were trying to restore what they'd forgotten. By the end of that week, we had soft commitments from 7 hospital systems and preliminary interest from 3 regulators. Bradley sent another email. I didn't even open it because the system was already speaking for me, and the world was starting to listen. They say, nothing burns like a slow fire. By week 3, the heat was visible: news segments, analyst downgrades, quiet investor exits. Metacon was bleeding in slow motion, and I was watching it from a second-hand couch in a co-working loft above a ramen shop. Somehow, that felt appropriate. Callahan Licensing Group was still in its infancy, barely 2 weeks registered. 3 white papers, half-written, our pitch deck rough and way too honest. But something strange had happened. People were listening. We didn't market ourselves. We didn't even have a sales team. But as Metacon faltered, hospitals and healthcare networks started reaching out. Not with desperation but curiosity. I remember our first real pitch. It wasn't flashy. A conference call with a European Teaching Hospital Alliance, the same network where Metacon's licensing portal had crashed during a routine audit. Their CTO looked tired, kind, a man who still believed in the mission beneath the machinery. I walked him through our framework. No centralized override. I said, control stays local. You get jurisdiction-aware compliance modules, adjustable diagnostic models, and full access to our audit trails. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen. And how do we know we won't lose access if your company's board gets greedy? We wrote that into the architecture, I said. Our code requires distributed authentication from a medical ethics panel and a clinical lead, not just corporate leadership. There was a long silence. Then he smiled. Good. By the end of the call, we had our first letter of intent. It was small, symbolic, but to us, it was the spark. Metacon didn't notice, of course. They were too busy trying to rewrite the international licensing stack from scratch. Maya sent us screenshots from inside their Jira board. They'd created something like 173 separate tickets labeled urgent, and half of them were conflicting patch strategies. One entry from Janelle caught my eye. Need to isolate Callahan_auth_gate, logic and override dual_token rec. She still thought she could reverse engineer my safeguards. I almost felt bad. Because it wasn't just about code, it was about conviction. By the start of month 2, we'd signed 3 hospitals. 2 were old Metacon clients, 1 was a network that had never adopted AI diagnostics because they didn't trust proprietary systems. That was our edge. We weren't just a fix, we were a rethink, and the world was hungry for a rethink. Metacon's new interim CEO tried reaching out, a healthcare executive with a clean track record and corporate speak that made my skin crawl. He requested a collaborative resolution. Translation: let's pretend none of this happened and move forward for the patients. Of course, I declined. 2 days later, Metacon's board offered acquisition. They wanted to buy Callahan Licensing Group outright. 8-figure offer. Complete control. Generous equity packages. PR rehabilitation for all involved. I read the email twice, then deleted it. They didn't want to collaborate. They wanted to disinfect. But the stain wasn't mine, it was theirs. Meanwhile, we were hiring. Our 10th employee was a former engineer from my original team, someone who had quietly left after realizing the company they'd loved no longer existed. The place is in freefall, he said during his interview. Janelle's still trying to brute force your architecture. Legal's in denial. And Bradley, gone, I said. Suspended. But not officially. I nodded, not surprising. The system doesn't collapse when the architect leaves, it collapses when people pretend the architecture doesn't matter, and Bradley had made a career of pretending. We brought in another advisor from the World Medical Consortium, an epidemiologist who'd been wary of AI-driven care for years. She looked at our protocols and said, "This is the first framework I've seen that assumes trust must be earned, not assumed." That became our motto: earned trust, embedded, enforced. Month 2 felt like a blur. Calls, demos, security, audits, hospitals in Brazil, regulatory teams in Japan, research clinics in Norway, all pinging us. Not just because Medicon was failing, but because we were offering something new. We weren't asking for trust, we were proving we didn't need blind faith. Our clients could read our source logic. Every compliance clause was mapped, every safeguard traceable. That level of transparency scared some people, but not the ones we wanted. The ones we wanted. They signed. Meanwhile, the Medicon spiral continued. Their European contracts began collapsing in legal arbitration. Their compliance backlog grew so large it started triggering auto fines from watchdog agencies. Their PR team issued a statement calling it an unfortunate technical transition period. But inside, they were panicking. Maya texted. Maya. Bradley was seen clearing out his office last night. Maya. Board's quietly shopping CEO replacements. Maya. Also, Janelle just sent a Slack message asking if anyone's ever heard of a shadow signature string. I almost laughed, because yes, they'd just found the second lock. The one tied to my voiceprint. The one they could never open. Not without me. By the end of the second month, we had 15 contracts in progress. For finalized, 11 mid-review. We were tiny, underfunded, and operating out of shared desks, but we were winning. And Medicon, they weren't just losing clients, they were losing the illusion of control. Because when architecture is built with ethics, it doesn't crumble loudly, it quietly refuses to cooperate, and no amount of corporate scrambling can undo that. The morning Bradley resigned, I was in Geneva, reviewing notes for a policy summit on AI medical ethics. The irony wasn't lost on me. As Medicon unraveled from the inside, I was being asked to help draft what might become the first global guidelines on AI oversight in healthcare. One of the delegates from Sweden leaned in over the conference table and whispered, "What happened at Medicon? Is it true you built the licensing infrastructure?" I smiled without answering. Because by now, everyone knew. Even if I'd never given an interview, even if Callahan Licensing Group had no press division, the truth had embedded itself into the very bones of the industry. The leaked emails told part of the story. Bradley's internal messages describing me as a potential point of failure. His push to consolidate executive override into a single chain of command, but the code told the rest. The logic I wrote. The traps I didn't need to conceal. The safeguards that only seemed like problems once they got in the way of expansion. By the end of month 3, Callahan Licensing Group had grown to 4 employees, most of them former Medicon staff engineers, ethicists, even some from compliance who knew the real value of what we'd built the first time, and understood why we had to do it differently now. We didn't call it revenge, we called it reclamation. The work was relentless. Every hospital we onboarded had to go through a full transition protocol, exporting encrypted diagnostic models, rebuilding jurisdictional parameters, syncing with our ethical compliance shell, but they didn't mind, because for the first time, they could see how everything worked. Our model was deliberately transparent. Visual dashboards for every licensing contract, real-time logs of data access, ethics audit history embedded directly into the UI. No passwords hidden in folders, no policy changes without dual-party acknowledgement, and certainly no silent revocation risks. The feedback was overwhelming. Doctors, administrators, even public health officials praised the system for something no one had said in years. It feels like it respects us. Meanwhile, Medicon's stock dropped below $30. For the first time in 4 years, their last earnings call was a disaster. A shareholder openly asked, "Why is a 3-month-old company winning contracts we've spent 5 years developing?" The CFO tried to blame external market volatility. The CEO just nodded and said nothing. Then came the acquisition rumor. A pharmaceutical conglomerate, Pharmatech Global, was in talks to buy Medicon at a fraction of its former value. They would absorb the IP, downsize the staff, and quietly shelve the international infrastructure. Medicon could no longer operate. It was the corporate equivalent of throwing the body overboard to stop the ship from sinking. Maya called me that night. "You've done it," she said. "It's over." "No," I replied. "Now it begins." Because the point wasn't to punish Medicon, it was to prove there's another way to build. A month later, Janelle reached out. She'd left Medicon quietly, a few days after the acquisition was announced. Her email was surprisingly candid. "I was used. I know that now. I thought I was replacing someone outdated, but all I did was trace your footsteps through code I didn't understand." We met in person the following week. She looked older than I remembered, more tired, but also more honest. "I'm not asking for a role," she said. I want to help rebuild the right way." I hired her, not because she'd earned it yet, but because I'd learned something. Too. People change. Especially when they've seen what happens when systems forget the values they were built on. We gave her a role in our diagnostics transparency team. She dove in, working late, asking real questions. And in one of our meetings, she said something that stuck with me. "I used to think innovation was about speed. Now I think it's about memory." She was right, because the architecture always remembers. Even when the people don't. By the end of year one, Callahan Licensing Group was operating in 47 countries. Our ethical licensing framework had been adopted as a model by multiple health agencies. We weren't just an alternative anymore, we were the foundation of a new standard. And Medicon now, just a footnote in Pharmatech's quarterly reports. Their name stripped from the systems they once bragged about. Their AI diagnostics shelved, rebranded, sanitized. Bradley disappeared into consultancy. Janelle reemerged as a quiet leader in transparency advocacy. The board members who approved my termination went on to other ventures, pretending none of it ever happened. But the architecture didn't forget. Neither did the hospitals who sent me thank you messages. The patients who wrote to say our diagnostic system caught something early. The regulators who now ask before a crisis, "How do we make sure this tech is governed ethically?" The system we built wasn't flashy, it wasn't aggressive, it was honest, and that made it revolutionary. Because when you build with integrity, even the parts you leave behind can't be used against you. They can only wait for the next right signature, and I made sure that this time, the only hands allowed to hold the pen were the ones who remembered why we picked it up in the first place.